But soon you will be gone and there will be another he can fawn over, whether at work, or in the street or here at number 8. Petunia's voice had become wistful and she looked across to the dressing table and then past it to Privet Drive beyond. Never good enough, she added, walking towards the window and looking out onto the block-paved road. She turned back quickly and fixed Cecilia with a stare, but behind it years of bitterness and sorrow permeated, like the admission of larceny by a vicar. I was never good enough. I'm never good enough, she continued, holding on to her nerve as her woes, like guilty secrets, were suddenly spilled into the atmosphere between them. They all said it. I just wanted to live my life. I had to lie to my friends until there were none left. And then Vernon came along and took me away from all that. Between the two women silence reigned again, and Petunia Dursley sank onto the damask bedstead. So, who are you? She asked after a while, turning to look at Cecilia. And you haven't answered my question. Cecilia Wells, replied Cecilia, and Petunia narrowed her eyes. Cecilia Frobisher, she corrected. I was once Cecilia Wells, but I married. Ah, you fell into that trap, muttered Petunia, her voice harsh and cold. And, unmagical Cecilia Frobisher, why are you in the wizard world? Surely they hate moles as much as they did when years ago? Probably more so, nodded Cecilia slowly. I was employed by a wizard to help them defeat a powerful, terrible wizard. And I suppose this wizard would be Voldemort, would it? You'd be surprised what I know, Mrs. Frobisher, she added as a look of astonishment crossed Cecilia's features and she got back to her feet. I too know of the wizard world. That would be the same Voldemort who killed my sister, attacked my nephew and caused him to be left on my doorstep. Cecilia nodded. So I ask you again, what are you doing here? And how are you connected with my sister? Cecilia nodded slowly, looking at her, the Lily's notes in Petunia's hand. What do you know of science, Mrs. Dursley? What? Cecilia could see she had caught the woman standing before her off guard. The wizard who contacted me, and I am sure that if you know of Voldemort then you know of whom I am speaking. She paused and Cecilia saw a wave of recognition pass over her features. Dumbledore? Dumbledore, confirmed Cecilia. He engaged my services as a scientist and teacher of science to enable the wizard world to defeat Voldemort. But I have to admit, I didn't know that those were written by your sister. Again, there was silence. Petunia stared down at the notes in her hand and back at Cecilia. So, why are you here? Not to educate my son, then? On the contrary, I am here to do that, Cecilia replied, looking back at the notes with a pang of longing. Maybe Petunia Dursley would change her mind about keeping them. I am in danger from the Ministry of Magic and it was arranged that I took the place of the woman who was supposed to be with you. I am here as long as you need me to educate Dudley. Again, a pocket of silence filled only with Cecilia's breathing. Of course now was exactly the right time to have a dizzy spell, she scolded herself. This science then, you were called upon to save the world of wizards? Repeated Petunia Dursley, paraphrasing Cecilia's passage as she sat down on the bed. I would be most interested to hear of it. Please, sit. She tapped the bedspread next to her. Cecilia felt her heart beat heavier behind her chest as she contemplated what to say. She shouldn't say anything, not to a mole really. Dumbledore had told her before that to reveal her work to a mole should jeopardize her memory. But then genetically Petunia Dursley was a wizard and she had claimed refuge in her home. Cecilia owed her something. It was a risk, but she knew she must take it. There is a way for Voldemort to be defeated. Harry is the only one who could do this because of the connection between them. For the science to work I had to collaborate with him closely in order to be close. We aren't there yet. So what does that have to do with me? Cecilia nodded. It was a fair question. She was sitting in her house, eating her food, following the pretense of tutorship. And, as she could remember everything that she could 5 minutes ago, it was a pretty good guess to infer that her premise about the magical abilities of Petunia Dursley, however innate, was sound. What if I were to tell you were, genetically, a wizard? Or a witch at any rate. Your sister was a witch. At this statement Petunia Dursley snorted. And therefore logically you carry a gene which shows that you could be a witch. Breaking off again, Cecilia saw the expression set upon Petunia Dursley's face. She had hit on something, but what? Was Petunia about to tell her? Whatever protected my nephew protects him in our home, replied Mrs. Dursley sharply, her expression becoming fixed. That isn't right, thought Cecilia. I don't know what exactly isn't right, but something was wrong. And what she had given was not the explanation for the look on her face when Cecilia had mentioned a genetic link to wizardry. Now tell me, while I decide what to do about you prying in here, why are you in my home? Other than to hide from the law and educate my son? She had a right to know, thought Cecilia grimly. She, Cecilia, had had this pressing on her chest for a fortnight to the point of suffocation, and the rest for almost a year. Despite Mrs. Dursley's assertive tone which was compelling Cecilia to tell all, she could almost feel the relief leave her like a pressure cooker. So, over the course of the next half an hour she told Petunia about her presence at Hogwarts, about the battle and how it had been arranged for her to come somewhere safe, though she mentioned no names or specific details. Throughout the time Petunia listened unquestioningly, and the small inkling of guilt that Cecilia had taken advantage of the woman and her hospitality began to ebb away. During that time Petunia Dursley sat next to her, listening without interruption. When Cecilia finished she got to her feet and began to pace about her own bedroom. And you believe that somehow I am magical? Somehow I am a witch? Because I promise you this, Mrs. Frobisher, I am nothing of the sort. Petunia laughed, the sound tinged with hysteria. Whatever made you come up with such a ludicrous suggestion? It is no wonder that you haven't got that potion, or whatever it is you're making right yet, if that's what you think. Cecilia said nothing as the defensiveness in Petunia's voice told a different story. So you are to be married to a wizard, is that right? And you need these, for this? Petunia paced back towards her, holding out the notes in front of Cecilia cruelly, like someone teasing a child with sweets. She'd already told her she wasn't going to give them to her. Remus, began Cecilia, her throat dry. They were there. Just inches from her. She could snatch them and run. The wizard I'm going to marry. He has a disease, and these notes have helped me to get so far with the process. Aha! Exclaimed Petunia, pulling the pages out of reach and looking at them intently. What sort of disease? What sort of disease requiring the knowledge of the moon and Huck? She'd got to the part about becoming a werewolf, thought Cecilia, shuddering. She's going to throw me out for sure. Have them, declared Petunia, holding them loosely with an outstretched arm. They're of no practical or sentimental use to me, but they are to you. My dear, she exclaimed, her tone softening when she saw Cecilia's face. Here, she added, pushing them into Cecilia's hand. I loved like that once. My hypothesis is not wrong, said Cecilia softly as she held on to S.N. Lily's notes and looking vacantly into the distance as if talking to someone far off. People can be wizards and witches without knowing it, in the same way that someone with an inherited disease doesn't always know. But it's the waiting for a moment to show itself. Stopped and looked at Petunia. Instead of rebuking her this time she looked back at Cecilia, who got up to her feet, walked over to the dressing table and put hand on the drawer, then turned back, a look of horror on her face. You're not a teacher then? You're not qualified to teach Dudley? I want you out of my house, you little outlaw. I am no witch, but I have a good mind to find these authorities who seek you. And then perhaps you'll stop this ludicrousness. As she bore down on Cecilia she whipped the notes back out of her hand and marched away, holding them in both hands as if to tear them into shreds. Mrs. Dursley!" exclaimed Cecilia in alarm. "Please. I'll go. I'll leave your house and family and never return here again." "Please don't," she declared as Petunia held the notes written by her sister above her. Instead of ripping them as Cecilia thought she was going to, Petunia Dursley lowered her arms and looked at the pages. "My dearest sister," said Petunia, not to Cecilia but to the notes, whose corners were lifting a little as if in response. "You wrote these? When you left us? When he wanted nothing more to do with me because I wasn't you? When you left me with our parents to look after? When, through your involvement in something or other, they were killed? When you were killed?" Cecilia watched as she shook her head as if chastising a child for bad behavior. Then she looked at Cecilia and threw Lily's notes across to her, Petunia's face a mask of sorrow. "How is it you came by them again?" she asked as Cecilia held the notes tightly in her hand. "Seeing as you became aware of them only recently?" "I was given them by the wizard who I worked with on the Universal Link. Harry's potion," she clarified as Petunia Dursley wrinkled her features in incomprehension. "I thought they were something to do with this, but they turned out to be a hope, a dream, a shadow. Something that you could cling to now you are absent from him," finished Petunia bitterly. "I am quite familiar with that cruel tactic, having been a victim of it before myself." Cecilia stopped in her reply suddenly as she replayed the sentence that she had just heard. Was Petunia Dursley suggesting that someone knew that she and Remus were to be separated, and Snape had given her these as a way of keeping her quiet? Another thought struck her, and then another. Were these notes a dead end? Was she being kept away with a hope, a dream, a shadow, while other things that they did not trust her with unfolded? Looking up from the notes, the expression on Petunia Dursley's face of contempt and mistrust mirrored her own feelings. And then, just as she was beginning to doubt everything and everyone, Cecilia smiled a little at Petunia Dursley. "Mrs. Dursley, you love your family, don't you?" She nodded stiffly, taken aback. "Well, I love a wizard. And because I do, I'm persecuted by their ministry." She trailed off as Petunia Dursley crossed the becarpeted floor and sat on the bed, gesturing for her to sit again. "I know all about wizards. You wait, when they've finished with you, they'll cast you aside. They think us nothing at all, wizards." She paused, her voice cut with pity and sympathy as disbelief flashed over Cecilia's features. "They have used you for what they want, and now they dump you here. Now you're past your usefulness." Petunia Dursley began to shake, her voice raw and high-pitched as if she were holding back from choking on tears. Yet her face remained fixed and her eyes hollow as she got to her feet and began to pace furiously. "Do you think I wanted to be reminded of her when I got my life and family together, all by myself? And then I was forced to bring up her son, who every day reminded me of her, how brilliant she was, what she could do. And what I cannot. I hate her, even now she's dead. I loved her. She was wonderful. And then she became a witch. Mother and father thought it was marvelous. I got my O-levels. Where do you think they were? Shopping in Diagon Ui. I was about to go to college to start my A-levels, and where were they? Waiting for her to get off the train. Everything was Lily, and she was so down to earth about it too. I didn't want her pity. I just wanted everything to be normal. I wanted to be an older sister. I wanted to show her things, do the older sister thing. She turned to look out of the window and Cecilia saw her shoulders sag and Petunia Dursley put her hands to her face. Cecilia stood up and moved next to her, giving her a comforting hug. No matter how different they were both older sisters. It was a hard burden for which no one ever prepared you. Could she imagine not being the experienced older sister to Amy? Having it all taken away from her? Petunia Dursley pulled away from Cecilia and smiled. "You're right, of course," she said, walking away from Cecilia and across to the built-in wardrobe that was adjacent her dressing table. "On both counts. It was taken away from me, and as an older sister yourself you understand." She smiled again as she opened the wardrobe and took out a small box which she laid on the table as Cecilia stared back at her, mouth open in disbelief. "The second count being the genetic link I denied earlier to you." From the box, wooden and small, she removed a piece of paper, yellowed and aged, which she unfolded and spread out on the desk. "I don't know really why I kept it, only that it reminded me who I am, not what I wasn't." Handing it to Cecilia, she smiled wanly as Cecilia read it. "It was the first time that I realized I could. Well, mind reading sounds awfully naive. When I realized I could tell what someone was thinking. Feeling. Even before they did, or at the same time." She watched as Cecilia read the brief note that she, Petunia, had written when she was 8 before handing it back to her. "My mother had something she had to tell father, and I was able to waylay him before he went off to work so she could. I wrote that just afterwards," she added, folding the note in half then half again before replacing it in its box. "It doesn't happen all the time," Petunia added, as if filling in the blanks created by Cecilia's unuttered words. "If I concentrate." Mind reading, thought Cecilia. Telekinesis. The ability to discern thoughts and feelings. Before she could think any more, Petunia Dursley swept up the small box again and flung it back into the wardrobe. "They called me a freak when they found out. But when Lily got her letter, I thought. Cecilia sighed. Not a witch like Lily, but her genes showed that she had some innate magical ability. Breaking off from her thoughts, Cecilia found herself moving towards Petunia again. The woman's shoulders were sagging and moving up and down. She was crying. As soon as Cecilia touched her, she found herself crying too. "What can I do to help?" asked Petunia when her tears had reduced to a sniffle, a few minutes later. "How can I help you, Cecilia, as a mole?" "Tell him," said Cecilia definitely. "Let him know. I wish I could explain all I want to, but. Tell Dumbledore. That will give the wizard who is working on the potion for Harry, the best possible chance." There was a pause, a long, drawn-out silence. Petunia Dursley stepped away from Cecilia and folded her arms defensively, walking away from her towards the bedroom window. "No. I've denied it all my life. I want to be a mole. I want to be ordinary, just Petunia, like I was called. I don't want this." Cecilia stayed where she was. It was like dealing with a wounded animal. Now she had to be tentative and coax, both of which were not traits that Cecilia found easy to manifest. It didn't matter what happened now. Cecilia knew that not only her hypothesis of a spectrum of ability in wizards was correct, but that the idea about environmental conditions and choices was also true. What mattered now was that Dumbledore knew it, and Snape. "You can no more change this part of you than you can your own hair color. Oh, you can dye it, but nature will out in the end. Your nephew has to stand in front of the most terrible and powerful wizard ever and trust in the potion me and my colleague have made for him. Acknowledging this, and that's all you need to do, means you can ensure his safety, Petunia. I can understand your feelings towards your sister. Jealousy. Anger. Resentment." Cecilia broke off as other words popped on the surface of her mind. "I feel this too. She was the first one who Remus loved. And now I know why. Lily must have worked this out when she was no more than 14 years old. She called on her understanding of the mole world too. And had no problem with approaching someone who could help her to find the solution, all completely selflessly." In her heart Cecilia knew she should have felt awe and wonder in the latent presence of this young witch's ability, not only her cognitive abilities but her way of being able to deal with people. Perhaps it was the deep loathing and resentment that Petunia Dursley was radiating as she stood with her back to Cecilia that made her feel somewhat hostile towards Lily Potter too. "This is about you, who you really are. You can make a difference." "No." Petunia Dursley spun round, her face red and her arms still folded. Defensiveness was her shield as she stood before Cecilia. willing her not to ask her to recognize this trait that she had clearly chosen to deny. "No," she repeated. "I chose what I wanted to do." When, Cecilia could see tears of anger welling again when they chose my faultless sister over me, she turned, clenching the dressing table's gilt handle with a strength mightier than her frame would betray, her bony knuckles whitening around it. When they chose that world. Her voice trailed off, towards the window, towards the street below, towards the world. I know I could have been a witch, not much of one, maybe. I chose not to be. I choose to be something Lily could not be. Petunia turned sharply and looked accusingly at Cecilia. She could not choose to be a mole. Ordinary. A mole. Don't you want normality? Don't you just wish to be plain? All that glamour. All that fascination. Surely it's better to know what's around you? She wasn't talking to Cecilia anymore. Her voice was distant and Cecilia had the distinct impression that she was trying to convince herself, maybe her past self. Or maybe even her sister, as if begging her to remain at home and not return to Hogwarts. An image flashed across her visual memory, of Lily Potter walking down a cobbled street, which was odd as, of course, Cecilia had never met Lily, nor had she any recollection of the scene. And then Cecilia realized that Petunia was staring at her with cold scrutiny as she had done the first day she had laid eyes on her doorstep when she had stood there with a flimsy excuse and a bag of snake-packed clothes. Trying not to allow it to sway her from her course, Cecilia smiled. "Mrs. Dursley. Petunia," she began, ignoring the suspicion with which she was being viewed. "If your sister had not been a witch, would you still have felt the same way?" The question remained unanswered, or at least not in the conventional verbal sense. Petunia Dursley folded her arms, as if hugging herself close in an attempt at comfort and consolation. "I am a lucky Cecilia Frobisher," she replied in a tone of pure certainty. "I got myself a good husband who is hardworking, even if he does have roaming eyes. I have a son. I have got my life. Something that's mine. I've worked hard for it. I did it on my own. No one can deny my hard work with my family, and now the skill I once had is only a shadow now. It is nearly gone, and I will celebrate the day when I am no longer able to read minds. When I am normal." Without realizing it, Cecilia nodded in agreement. At last she understood Mrs. Dursley. Doting on her family and her level of cleanliness and tidiness. She was no house-proud housewife. She had fought back against whatever injustice she felt had been meted out to her when she was younger, when she had no voice. Almost every fibre of her being was with Petunia Dursley on this one. Almost every one. A small voice in the back of Cecilia's mind was kicking out to get her attention. If only she could show Mrs. Dursley that by sharing her knowledge this would help purge her still further of this hateful thing that she called magic. Then she realized Petunia Dursley was staring at her again. "Well, if you don't want to share it with Dumbledore. Perhaps another wizard? Perhaps Harry's godfather. Sirius Black." She spat, as if the name itself was a poison to her. "I have met this wizard before." And then, just as Cecilia thought Petunia Dursley was going to say no more on the subject, a torrent of words as if from a broken tap, almost as hot and as acid as she had used to illustrate her feelings about Lily, spilled from her as if they too had been damned and waiting the opportunity to be spilled. "I threatened to join them at Hogwarts to find out what all the fuss was about, but really I just wanted to get away. When those horrible boys found me I felt so angry. And they spoke to me as if I were a child. Sirius Black told me that he had only come to find me because of Lily, and he wouldn't have been bothered otherwise. I swore from that day on that I would have nothing more to do with wizards and their interfering ways. I told my sister never to contact me again. And now she has." Petunia Dursley gestured to the notes about lycanthropy and Cecilia sank to the bed, looking down at them in her hand. And now she felt jealousy. Envy for someone else long since gone whom she had never even met. She knew Remus, her Remus, better than Lily had done. Oh, no wonder he felt love for her. Someone who could rid him of this torment. An all-round dash. Do-gooder, finished Petunia Dursley, stiffly. It was always the same, even when we were children. If someone had a broken bone, then she would want to mend it. Children lost, she would find them. Couldn't even stop interfering when I wanted to get miles from her and our family, had the whole lot after me, didn't she? Didn't she understand that I just wanted to be dash? Left alone. Cecilia nodded grimly. The arrogance of wizards. Thinking that moles can't make decisions for themselves. Petunia. May I call you that? She waited until the woman nodded before continuing. Your son, he will make good. Like his father. He is intelligent, but lazy. Perhaps a small time at Mr. Dursley's work, to show him what hard work is like. That he has to work hard to get the rewards. He is progressing adequately, though I won't lie to you, he probably won't achieve what you expect of him this year. He could, however, do much better were he to repeat his 5th year. Even without this he will not perform as badly as could have. Silence reigned. It was of a duration that could only rival those which she and Snape had created, and it was clear Cecilia's turn of direction had thrown Petunia Dursley somewhat. If it's any consolation, the wizard who needs this information hates Harry, and it's mutual. And past the enduring silence, Petunia Dursley approached Cecilia and hugged her. I could, she said, dangling the bait over the side of the boat for an eager Cecilia to pay attention to. Can you explain to me about the potion, and about this work that will help your fiancé? Cecilia nodded and extended a hand as Petunia let her do. The woman shook it, nodding. Sorry about your husband, Cecilia continued, spreading the notes out onto the dressing table next to her half-written letter to Snape via Dumbledore. Of your nephew's potion I've already told you. However, it was because I was asked to come up with it that I determined that wizardliness was not simply a case of you were or you weren't. That's where a small sample of your hair came in, cunningly swiped when you weren't looking came in, she added with a smile to help ease the look of worry on Petunia Dursley's face. That's how I got the DNA trace and worked out that you had this ability. You are able to use energy in a way that ordinary moles can't. Although you have chosen not to let that continue, Cecilia added, acknowledging Petunia's admission earlier. Of the second. Over the course of the next 10 minutes, Petunia Dursley became the first person to hear the most up-to-date hypothesis that Cecilia Frobisher had formulated with regard to a relationship between lycanthropy, the moon and the universal link. It went like this. Her fiancé was not only he is a wizard. He's was werewolf too. Petunia gasped. Cecilia nodded sagely. He got bitten as a child by a crony of Voldemort because his father was protecting vital information. Cecilia reached down into her pocket for the crumpled jottings she had placed there just before she had entered Petunia Dursley's bedroom. The effects of the moon upon water, which whatever in his cells caused him to metamorphose once a month, the moon's gravitational influence upon the water in his body was likely to be the key. Silver harms him, but it's something genetic, something that affects his cells. The moon has something to do with it, it's tidal. It affects water. Oh God. I would do anything to help him. It's so painful for him. In frustration, not only for her inability to think straight but also because of her inability to be with him, she threw her notes and those of Lily Potter on the floor. This time it was Petunia who listened. Tell me about your life, before knowing about magic. And that was just what Cecilia did next. She told her how she had firstly given up teaching, how she had been a science teacher and how she had seen the advertisement in the newspaper. I did wonder, you have taught Dudley something. And your first husband? Died, said Cecilia sadly. In fact, he was murdered by the Dark Wizards for sport, it would seem. He had a climbing accident, they kept him on Scawfell Pike and he developed pneumonia and died. If you could go back, would you? If you had a choice, 2 paths, equal and open. Would you go back to your old life? With your friends and family, rather than this? Cecilia stopped. If she had two paths. She realized she mustn't have said anything, as Petunia had continued talking. Instead of sitting next to her, Cecilia watched as the woman got back to her feet and moved away from to the window, folding her arms. You won't fit in with our society now that you have chosen the wizard world. There's no coming back. You can't forget about it. Even if they do perform a mind spell. She looked at Cecilia carefully. Your mind feels foggy. But eventually you know. I knew. I fought it. They weren't going to deprive me from knowing. And when I did, I knew I didn't want any part of it ever. Cecilia began to cry, feeling the rivulets of tears on her cheeks. Her Remus. She didn't care if she couldn't fit back into the mole world. Her world was with him, wherever that might be. If she had two paths, one keeping her in the mole world that day in July and one compelling her to take the train to London. A split second if both consequences of the choices were revealed to her at Birmingham New Street as clear and bright as the train times and platform displays above the ticket kiosks. There was no choice. She turned when she realized Petunia Dursley had sat back down next to her and put an arm around her shoulders. I love him so much, she sniffed, bending low over her lap with her hands to her face. He's been through so much. He suffers so and never complains. The rest of Cecilia's thoughts, her frustrations at being here, her sorrow at being apart from Remus Lupin, her annoyance and anger towards Severus Snape for leaving her here, all remained unspoken as she soaked her jeans in salt water. Petunia let her cry for a few moments before, as the sobs began to lessen, she let go her embrace, looking around her own bedroom at the beautifully decorated walls, the immaculate carpet and the handmade curtains. As do I, Cecilia. My Vernon. It breaks my heart to see him acting like this. And I know it's to do with them. And then it was Cecilia's turn to comfort Petunia. As she had held her shoulder, Cecilia took Petunia's hand comfortingly, much older and bonier than her slightly plump own of her own. I fell in love with Vernon. And I've always been in love with him. He wasn't as good looking as other boys, or as talented. He doesn't possess many qualities. He likes his home comforts and order and certainty. And now. He feels uncertain. He feels unsure, and it's my fault, deep down. You could solve this. Write to Dumbledore. Tell him about yourself. Her eyes sparkled past the glimmering tears. He can inform the wizard who is making the potion for Dash. Harry, finished Petunia, glancing at Cecilia's letter on the table. If you were to add your experiences to this, it would help a great deal, encouraged Cecilia. You could ensure your sister didn't die in vain, that Harry had a greater chance of succeeding anyway. What they intend is to arrange for his death then, with a potion to defeat Voldemort. Cecilia shook her head. Whatever is going to happen, will happen. Whatever Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix, the secret organization that Lily was once a part of, Cecilia added unnecessarily, for the look on Petunia Dursley's face told her that she was already familiar with it. Whatever will happen with Voldemort will happen, and Harry would be involved whatever happened. This way he had a chance of not only surviving but defeating him. Cecilia inhaled. The whole world will be free of the terror, and not just wizards, but you and your family too, and me. I might get to see my family again, she thought wistfully, picturing for the first time in ages the faces of first her mother and then her sister. You might get to see your family, repeated Petunia quietly. I have addressed it, insisted Cecilia unabashed. All you need to do is write down what you know. What you feel. Just pop it in postbox and it will get where it needs to be. But Petunia shook her head again, held the letter out to Cecilia. She stared at it and folded her arms. My sister lives in Scotland with my mother and my best friend's sister. She doesn't know who I am. My best friend and her husband. Little Freya's mother. They were murdered by the enemy's followers. All my family, me included, are moles. Persons of no magical ability, but we can die as easily as them. It's a wizard war that includes us. Where nearly everyone like us has no idea of the danger. Like Halloween last year. 800 of us. That was put down to a. Petunia trailed off as Cecilia shook her head. Voldemort's gift to a handful of followers. We are no more than vermin to them. She shuddered and thought about her time in his presence. It was intoxicating. She was compelled to remain. To listen. In her guise as Snape on the night of the great battle. For a few moments, there was silence. I will think about it. The words appeared in Cecilia's mind without having passed through her ears. And they appeared to have been unspoken by Petunia herself. I will think about it, repeated Petunia, taking the half-written letter from Cecilia's hand and putting it into her cardigan pocket. And let that be the end of it. If you are to be in my house and you are to teach my son as effectively as you have been doing so far, I suggest that you get prepared, as Mr. Dursley will be bringing him home later on this evening. Cecilia frowned. Surely Dudley was back at boarding school now? We are pleased with your tutoring and wish Dudley to benefit from it in the evenings. Then Petunia Dursley reached for a tissue from the box on her dressing table, flattening out the sheets before reaching up to her own dark blonde head. The self-declared mole wrapped the strands into a flat parcel before pulling out the letter that Cecilia had half-written inside. Cecilia watched with bated breath and her heart hammering underneath her ribs as Petunia Dursley found a pen from one of the dressing table drawers and began to write before glancing at her mistrustfully, scowling at it before leaving both the letter and hair strands and striding out of her own bedroom, leaving Cecilia Frobisher sitting awestruck on the bed. When she was sure Petunia had gone, Cecilia grabbed for the letter, reading quickly the rather incomprehensible couple of paragraphs, including the one about Dudley. Most of it appeared to be in some sort of code, though English, odd words here and there which meant nothing to Cecilia. Picking up the pen that Petunia Dursley had left beside the powder compact on her dressing table, Cecilia added another note to Snape asking him to check both hair samples. On the tissue paper that Petunia had encased a lock of her hair, Cecilia wrote, PD, and on the other she wrote, DD. She added a comment about the possible medium solution that would work to dissolve the hair in order to analyze it with the microscope, as well as adding that to further check, sample of Dudley's hair too. And then she risked a few choice comments about silver nitrate, the moon and its tidal extremities, and how, were a potion to be developed, administering one at such a time might be the way forward. After carefully not signing her name and before she returned the letter to Petunia Dursley, Cecilia sketched a little monkey sitting behind a typewriter. The last thing Petunia Dursley remembered thinking about her sister before her confrontation with Mrs. Frobisher was an argument they had had. They had both been pregnant, but instead of embracing the fact and the maternal instinct between them bringing them together, it had seemed to do the opposite, with Lily offering the olive branch and Petunia, feeling patronized and insulted, throwing it back in her face. In fact, Lily had not even told her she was expecting, but Petunia knew. It was this uncanny ability to know such things which was her gift, something which could have led her into wizardry. Petunia Dursley sat at the dining room table, chin in her hands and staring out into the garden, trying to block out the thoughts of the tutor that she had been deceived into accepting into her home, who would, in a few minutes' time, give her the sealed envelope and ask her to post it. In the garden a slight breeze tickled her azaleas and she watched their marvelous heads flutter a little with the energy she had loved once, like Cecilia loved. But the object of her affection did not think her ability was sufficient enough reason to love her back, in the end. Oh, she had had her letter all right, much later and seemingly as an afterthought. It did not contain what she wanted to hear, and then he tossed her aside, causing her to run, causing her to discover the shoulder of a non-magical man, a stoical, down-to-earth, dependable person. It was then that she had sworn to forget, and live her life how she had chosen. If she recalled this all now, every inch of her memory, every part of her ability from the moment she had heard her mother thinking about which shop she would buy her daughter's new shoes from, what she and Lily were going to have at Christmas or on birthdays, and the odd thoughts and memories of people around them even when they were miles away. Then she would have gone back on her choice. Lily had been her little sister, and she had betrayed her. But this woman was right. She would be helping. She had to think of it as not helping the wizard world but helping the non-magical world, the world she had chosen. The unspoken words that Cecilia Frobisher had uttered, the little secrets she had though but hadn't shared. The wizards, the events, the people. Even down to her modesty that she had not used to blackmail her with, which she could so easily have done. And above all, her dogged faith that she was doing right. So like her sister, and also, like she would have done had the world around her given her a chance. She had atoned for it all many times over by taking in Harry, although she knew in her heart of hearts it wasn't really enough. Now, by getting it out of her system she could help her world, the non-magical world, the ones who had no choice, the ones whom the magically gifted took for granted. Once she had finished it she would be admitting it. There was no taking it back. It meant that all the stuff that happened when she was younger she had accepted, and put behind her. She could live her life free of blame and guilt. Someone other than Vernon accepted her and she was sitting in her living room waiting to help her son. She knew Cecilia had had no choice, but she also knew that she had accepted to wait claustrophobically and confined. And it was her own admiration of that which had compelled Petunia to take the letter from Cecilia Frobisher, return back upstairs and finish off what she meant to say as her son's tutor prepared hastily for her unforeseen tuition duty. It was written. At the end of Privet Drive on the corner with Chestnut Walk a pillar box stood. Petunia Dursley turned away from the post box, looked back down the road, at her street as her husband's car drew up on the drive. Her son, her beloved son. There would be nothing she needed when he was grown. They would remain at 4 Privet Drive for the rest of her life. Very little for her to do once her son was grown. Watering the garden, straightening the curtains. The domestic dream she had fought so hard to preserve now seemed a little dull when she realized what she was standing aside from. And then there were the arguments with Vernon. Looking at the innocuous white envelope she had in her hand, she silently thanked Cecilia Frobisher for insisting on and arguing the cause for her writing is. Now this would be the purge and they would stop their rows which always seemed to revolve around Harry, her family or magic. Turning back to the post box and looking at the black square standing out from the scarlet paintwork that indicated the next collection time was the letters spelled out Man 17.45 in white letters. Petunia looked at the address Cecilia Frobisher had written on it and to whom it was addressed. Dumbledore. She remembered writing that name on an envelope once before herself. Using the pen that she had taken with her out of the house she crossed out name. What was his name? That awful boy. He'd become a teacher too. Petunia tapped the end of her pen on the tip of her nose as she thought. A mental image appeared in her cerebellum. Above the obliterated name Albus Dumbledore, in clear round handwriting Petunia wrote a name, another that she written so many years ago yet was branded firmly in her mind. As Petunia pushed the letter into the post box a breeze circulated around her and she looked up to see the post box shake and quiver as the letter shot back out. At the same time an owl came out of nowhere and caught it in midair before tearing back off into the sky. Petunia Dursley watched the bird's wake until it was very definitely out of sight before walking quickly and lightly back towards her home and her family. 88,888,888. 3 a.m. and the cause of Harry's insomnia was, for once, not Lord Voldemort. The day had been a long one and by now, having carefully woven an intricate tapestry of misleads for Poodle Penright enjoying each and every one, those and the thought of returning to his bed had kept him going through another Bare Your Soul session with their new Mole Studies teacher. It wasn't until Harry had come to doze off, relaxing peacefully in the anticipated cushion of amnesia, that a thought he had dismissed and buried that day had infiltrated his drowsy mind like an errand wasp on a hot summer's day which he hadn't been able to make leave. The more Harry thought about it, the more it confused him. At first, it had occurred to him that it must have been a manifestation of his own consciousness, his unwillingness to share his intimate personal details with Penrite, coupled with his hatred for Snape and his desire to have the more comforting ear of Mrs. Frobisher as of a few months ago. That conclusion had steadied his mind somewhat and he had begun to doze off. But it didn't make sense. Then he had considered the possibility that the stories Ginny had made up as rumors and the situations they had joked about in the Gryffindor common room had become tangled in his mind. But on thinking deeper, Harry knew better than that. Another part of his mind replayed a part of his own memory which took place chronologically after his conversation with Snape when he had wished aloud that he didn't have to go to see Penrite that afternoon, occurring shortly after Snape's abrupt pause and his look of hatred. It had not been Snape's usual look of hatred that he usually reserved for Harry's benefit. He was well used to that. It had rather a more defensive edge than usual, as if he had let his guard down a little and the chink had revealed altogether too much for the wizard's liking. He could perhaps dismiss it as Snape's defensiveness about the location of Mrs. Frobisher. Harry had annoyed him. He knew by asking again. And he could accept this had not the content of the image that he had caught, mere seconds of it, been so horrifying. But Harry turned over in his bed, the undersheet of the covers entangling itself around his legs as he fought for physical as well as mental comfort. The thought that had belonged to Severus Snape that he had acquired. He and Ron had been had followed Cecilia Frobisher from Hagrid's hut, through the castle grounds and into the teacher's corridor before crouching outside the window adjacent to the door that she had flung open, announcing to her colleague in babbled rapidity that she had finally worked out the connection between wizards and muggles. They had been there, they had seen him kiss her forehead before letting her sleep. They had witnessed the next 3 hours. The image, so realistic in its form that had come from Snape's mind, was definitely something that had not gone on. For he had told Dumbledore so when she disappeared exactly what they had seen. So why would such an event, so clear and so obvious in its logical conclusion from the glimpses that he had discovered, why would it be in Snape's mind? Was it connected to his reason for not telling him, Harry, where she was? Two conflicting scenes were fighting for primacy in Harry's mind now as he recalled what his senses knew he had seen with Ron on the night that Mrs. Frobisher had gone to Snape with the universal link. He knew that he had seen Snape hold her hand and lean across her. He knew that Snape had kissed her on the forehead and left her to sleep as he went to read her notes. So why was this other scene, as strong and real as if it were his own, putting up such a fight? He and Ron would have remembered if well, that didn't happen. Harry looked across at the sleeping form of his friend. If he were to wake him up, he knew Ron would neither thank him or believe he were sane if Harry were to ask him if the latter memory had occurred. Not that he would be much help to Harry as it was, these days his first thoughts were for Hermione. Harry turned over and allowed the other scene to infiltrate his conscious mind. This is what hadn't happened. Snape had not removed his cloak, allowing it to fall to the floor. Neither had he sat next to her, nor leaned over Cecilia Frobisher on the bed, looking her up and down. Harry would have remembered if Snape had kissed her mouth as passionately as that, awakening her. And he would definitely have remembered if Snape had begun to dash. No. It was too horrifying to recall again, and Harry switched back to the first scene of Snape pushing back the red hair of the woman sleeping upon his bed to block out the rest of the horrifying memory that had been Snape's. Harry pushed himself up onto his pillow and stared wide-eyed at the back of the becurtained bed frame. So, if it had not been what had actually gone on that night, then what were such thoughts of him and Mrs. Frobisher doing in Snape's mind? And if he could evoke and then tap into such memories just by annoying him, what other little secret could he, Harry, compel him to betray?